I'm the director of the new Leverhulme Centre for Climate Change Mitigation. And the goal of the centre is to develop enhanced weathering as a means of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at scale to offset fossil fuel emissions. And we're right at the beginning of our programme, so I thought what I'd do today is start by telling you about the urgency of the climate change problem, and then tell you something about some Earth system simulations we've been doing to try and define the capacity of a vegetated land surface to sequester CO2, and then turning to crops, thinking about how it might work with crops, and to illustrate one or two of the key principles involved. Okay, so let's get on with it. So really, humanity owes a debt of gratitude to this man. This is David Beerling. And Keeling began making measurements of atmospheric CO2 in 1958. And his record of CO2 is now the longest continuous measurement series of CO2 in the world. And he made it on Mauna Loa in Hawaii, in the middle of the Pacific, with the idea that you were getting a global signal that was relatively unbiased by local urbanization. And this is the current record, so this is up to date as of July 2017. And you can see that since Keeling started making the measurements back in 1958, the CO2 has gone up now from about 310 parts per million to about just over 400 ppm. And this is a result of burning fossil fuels and land use change. And in fact, the latest data from Mauna Loa is that the global monthly CO2 concentration now exceeds 400 ppm. Okay, now the 406 ppm may not seem like much, but actually it's the highest the CO2's been for the last 2 million years, and probably the highest it's been for the last 20 million years. And so we should expect the Earth system to respond. And so this is an instrumental record of global temperature. So this isn't a set of model simulations, these are actual observations. And so the dots are annual temperature, and then the red line is the smoothed curve. And it goes back to 1880. Pre-1880, the instrumental record is regarded as not reliable, so that's why it starts at 1880. And it's expressed relative to a baseline value of 1920 to about 1950. And you can see the key feature of the record is that from about 1970, the temperature has been going up, and now the Earth is about 1 degree warmer than it was previously. The interannual variability shows some interesting trends as well. So there's a kind of curious spike here in the 1940s, which Jim Hansen has suggested might be related to a paucity of measurements in the northern hemisphere during the Second World War, so this is not a true global estimate of temperature. You can see the Super El Nino of 97-98 gave us a very warm temperature, and the Super El Nino of 2015-16 also gave us a warm temperature. And then in the late 1990s, you can see a period of cooling for several years linked to the eruption of Mount Pinatubo. So we've already had a warming of 1 degree. And in December 2015, under the Paris Agreement, the idea was that we'd try and keep the temperatures well below 2 degrees with an aspirational target of 1.5 degrees. Well, if you fit a linear trend, if you fit a linear curve to this data, or line to this data, then you get a warming rate of about 0.2 degrees per decade. So we've already had 1 degree, so you can see that within 3 decades we're already going to be well above 1.5 degrees. And given the technical and practical difficulties of decarbonising our energy sources, you could imagine that staying below 1 degree is going to be extremely difficult. So the last time the Earth was 1 degree warmer than now, or over 1 degree warmer than now, was 115,000 years ago during the last interglacial, the Eemian, and the equilibrium response of the Earth system to the Eemian temperature warming was an increase in sea level of 7 to 9 meters. So we shouldn't be surprised that our ice sheets are starting to melt This is a picture from Eric Steig's Real Climate blog. And this is the outwater flow from the west coast of Greenland. And they have these bridges that are constructed to transport vehicles around. And they'd never seen anything like it in 2012 when the outwater flow was at record levels and was knocking this machinery off the side of bridges. And so just to kind of quantify this then, so here's Greenland. And this is the number of melt days. So the hotter it gets, the more melt days you have. And on the right-hand side here, this is the average for the last 30 years. And you can see there's some melting on the west coast here. But in 2012, nearly the entire ice sheet was melting. Okay, so this is quite an elevational change. So we're even going up to high elevation on the ice sheet, and we're seeing significant melting. Another way to look at this is the percentage area of the Greenland ice sheet that's under melting. So this is percentage area of Greenland ice sheet against month of the year. And then the long-term 30-year average is this dotted blue line. And then this is what happened in 2012. We had nearly 100% of the ice sheet was under melting during midsummer. So the ice sheets are responding, and I could show you graphs of Antarctica and the Greenland ice sheet shedding increasing amounts, billions of tons of water, but I think this graphic captures it. So the underlying driver, of course, of all of this is our emissions of greenhouse gases, particularly CO2. And so these are our emissions since 1990, global emissions in billions of tons. And you can see that they increased from 1% in the 90s to 3% in the noughties. They've slowed a little bit, but in 2016 we were emitting just over 36 billion tons of CO2 every year. And as the Global Carbon Project pointed out, 2014-2015 were the highest emissions at that time on record, and 60% higher than they were in the 1990s. And if we carry on burning fossil fuels at this rate, then we're going to run out of fossil fuels, or run out of our quota of fossil fuels for staying below 2 degrees within 3 decades. And don't expect the Paris Agreement to save us either. So these are the intended emissions from the countries that have signed up to the Paris Agreement. This is global greenhouse gas emissions in billions of tons. This is 1990, so this is the curve I've just shown you. And the lower dotted line here, this is where we need to be if we want to avoid 1.5 degrees of warming. And this upper dotted line is where we need to be if we want to keep warming to 2 degrees. And these are our kind of these are the submitted emissions by the countries that have signed up to the Paris Agreement, and this is the adjusted, more optimistic version of those submitted emissions. And then, as you can see straight away, so the difference between where we are, or where we will be in 2030, and where we want to be if we want to keep warming to 2 degrees, by 2030 is somewhere between 17 and 21 billion tons. And the situation is even worse if we want to keep the climate warming to 1.5 degrees. It's somewhere between 23 and 27 billion tons. So there's a huge gap in the political rhetoric that you heard with the signing of the Paris Agreement, with all the politicians clapping themselves on their backs for doing a great job, and the scientific reality of how we're actually going to deliver 1.5 or 2.5 degree, or limit of warming to 1.5 and 2.5 degrees. So the emissions are a problem, but there's also inertia in the climate system, which means that the later we leave it to make our emission cuts, the more difficult it is to achieve our target. And this was illustrated in a nice article by Tom Stocker a few years ago in Science. And so what this shows is the starting year of emissions reduction versus the emission reduction rate you need to cut to achieve a given target of global warming. Okay, and so you can see that if we started in 2020, in order to hit a 2 degree target, then we'd need about a 3% cut in our global emissions. Whereas if we leave it another decade, then it now becomes even harder, and we need nearly 6% emissions cut to achieve a 2 degree target. And if we leave it another decade, then the 2 degree target has gone. So there's urgency in not only phasing down emissions, but also thinking about how we take CO2, how we might be able to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And in fact, there was a report last year by the National Academy of Sciences, a couple of years ago by the Royal Society, and also by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who all recognised the need for us to urgently try and figure out ways of safely taking CO2 out of the atmosphere at scale and in an affordable way. And so these need to be implemented alongside emissions cut. There's no magic solution. No one of these will fix the problem. And so there are, broadly speaking, 4 categories. We can go for afforestation and reforestation. Plant more trees, we reforest the planet, and we try and capture CO2. We could try and fertilize the oceans and increase the primary production of the oceans. So we convert some of that productivity to carbon rain on the seafloor to sequester CO2. Or we could try and manipulate the global biogeochemical cycling of carbon to capture CO2 through enhanced weathering. Or you could develop more industrial-based processes such as biomass energy and carbon capture or direct air capture, where we try and sequester CO2 through rather more artificial means. And so what I want to do today is really talk about enhanced weathering as a strategy for taking CO2 out of the atmosphere at scale. So what do I mean by enhanced weathering? What's the concept? So the idea is really using the photosynthetic energy of plants. So plants are nature's wonderful energy transducers. They convert solar energy into chemical energy, and then they export that chemical energy below ground to roots and their mycorrhizas. And so if we add crushed silicate rocks to the landscape, then the roots and the root microbiomes can accelerate the breakdown of these silicate rocks. And this releases base cations, anions, and bicarbonate. Some of it will lead to CO2 sequestration in soils. Ultimately, it will find its way into the oceans, where it can either be removed through biological precipitation of carbonate in the form of corals, or abiologically in the deposition of limestone. Or you can store it as actually bicarbonate in the surface oceans. And so some of the features of this approach then is that it uses natural silicate rocks, so we don't have to inject aerosols into the atmosphere to artificially cool the planet, as some geoengineering options have suggested. It could revolutionize approaches to climate change because it's harnessing existing agricultural practices. So we're already adding up to 10 tons per year of limestone to our croplands. And it's compatible with other CO2 management options, which I'll show you in a moment. So part of the remit of the new centre then is to develop numerical modelling approaches to try and figure out what's the capacity of the vegetated land surface to sequester CO2 in this way. And the way that we go about it then is to develop different sorts of models. So we can either use modern climate or future climate simulations simulated by general circulation models. And then we can couple those to global dynamic vegetation models that either represent the natural vegetation or agricultural systems. So we're talking about croplands. And then we need some representation of how the soil chemistry and the geochemistry of the runoff is affected by application of those rocks and how those rocks interact with the roots and the root microbiome. And so for that, we've been developing a number of numerical modelling approaches that capture the geochemistry of the plant microbe interactions. And then with those 3 sort of components set up, you can then embed it within an Earth systems model and ask, okay, so how does the carbon cycle respond? How would it affect atmospheric CO2? Or how would it affect ocean chemistry? So what I want to do then is introduce you to some simulations that we've been doing, which is really a kind of like Earth systems thought experiment. It's a kind of what if. How do we define the maximum capacity of the vegetated land surface to capture CO2 over the next century? And so one approach then would be to exploit all of these large igneous all the large reserves of basalts in igneous provinces. So basalt is a fast-weathering, calcium-rich silicate rock, and when it weathers, it captures carbon. And there are huge reserves left over from volcanic eruptions, ancient volcanic eruptions. And these red dots show you the distribution of these different basalt reserves. So you can see the Deccan traps in India that were produced during the extinction of the dinosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous, and the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, the Camp Province in eastern US and South America, and a little bit in Africa, that erupted as those three continents rifted apart with the birth of the North Atlantic. So there are really huge reserves of basalt, and they're all surface deposits. And so you can say, okay, well, let's just, in our thought experiment, let's mine some of these deposits and sprinkle it over the warmest, most productive areas of the world, which is, of course, the tropics. And if you do one third of the most productive tropical land in the tropics is about the same area as global croplands. It's about 10 million kilometers squared. So if you do these simulations, we can then ask them, we can interrogate the model and say, okay, well, what effect does it have on atmospheric CO2? And so these are some results of some simulations that we did a few years ago. So here's the next century. It's atmospheric CO2 concentration on the y-axis. Here's the business as usual scenario. So by the end of 2100, CO2 could be as high as 950. But if we sprinkled crushed basalt over 1/3 of the tropical land, then we could maybe lower CO2 by around 200 parts per million. And if you use, just for the sake of argument, if you used a faster weathering silicate rock called Hartsbergite, you could double that and maybe sequester 400 ppm. So it does seem to suggest then that there is scope for sequestering CO2 at scale. This is a summary of a much more detailed suite of simulations, but this is the kind of take-home message. But of course, there's also a cost for mining, grinding, and spreading these rocks. And it's fair to say that the life cycle analysis of this, stepping through these different processes, is still in its infancy. But the most comprehensive analysis that's been done so far is by Moosdorf and colleagues. And actually, if you look at the different processes, so mining is sort of peach, and then crushing and milling is orange. Transport and application are blue and mauve. And you can basically see that the main cost in terms of energy is crushing and milling these rocks. And that might vary from somewhere between 10% to about 30%. So your efficiency is going to be reduced by this carbon penalty associated with the energy costs of mining, grinding, and spreading, mostly associated with grinding. But seriously, if that's the worst of our problems, we can just innovate, right, and make solar-powered grinders. So it's not beyond the wit of man to deal with this. So one of the feedbacks that we can calculate with our Earth systems model then is ocean surface pH. And so this is often called the other climate change problem that you don't hear about, because you hear about climate warming, but the other side of the coin is that as the CO2 goes up, then it dissolves in the surface layer of the ocean and causes ocean acidification. And so our business as usual scenario of carrying on emitting CO2 drives the CO2 down from about 8.05 down to about just above 7.7. Now, if we were to add basalt to the 1/3 of tropical land, then you could ameliorate that by about a half, partly because you're taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, but also because as the basalt weathers, it's producing alkalinity, so the alkalinity flows into the ocean as well. And if you use Hartsbergite, then you almost directly nullify the effect of the rise in CO2. So it could not only take CO2 out of the atmosphere, but it could also benefit the oceans. And the corals would benefit as well, because coral health is linked to the aragonite saturation state of the oceans. So the CO2, when it dissolves, the hydrogen ion reacts with the carbonate to form bicarbonate. So it lowers the saturation state of the carbonate ions in the oceans. And this makes it much more difficult for the corals to precipitate their exoskeleton, their calcium carbonate skeleton. This is some work that was done by Ken Caldera's lab. And he basically shows, so here's the modern world, and then each of these white dots represents a coral reef. And then the colour contours represent the aragonite saturation state of the ocean. And then on the right-hand side, you can see it's like a frequency histogram. And you can see that all of these warm water corals are living in seawater where the aragonite saturation state is 3 or above. Now, if you look to the future then, by the end of 2100, our business as usual scenario, you can see that now the contours have become all red. So the aragonite saturation state of the ocean has dropped. It's now below 3. And now you can repeat, you plot the modern day distribution of warm water corals and you repeat your frequency histogram, you can now see that all of the coral reefs are living in seawater where the aragonite saturation state is below 3. Okay, so this means that even if we don't kill the corals with heat waves or with overfishing, then we will definitely kill them because they'll be unable to precipitate out their calcium carbonate skeletons by the end of the 21st century. So what about enhanced weathering? Can that help? So fortunately, we have full representation of these processes in our Earth systems model, so we can calculate the aragonite saturation state of the ocean. I'm going to show you some maps which have been deliberately coded to be blue if the aragonite saturation state of the ocean is 3.25 or above. Okay, so here's the pre-industrial world. Everybody's happy. We've got lots of blue, so the aragonite saturation state is suitable for coral growth. And then if we use a medium level mitigation simulation, so the CO2 reaches about 650 parts per million by 2100, then you can see that we've now lost all of the blue. So the coral reefs are in trouble. But then we can repeat the calculation, including a basalt application to 1/3 of tropical land, and you can see that we start to recover some of the blue. And if you do the same thing again with a higher basalt application, so this is 1 kilogram per meter squared, this is 5 kilograms, then you almost completely recover the aragonite saturation state of the ocean as it was in the pre-industrial world. So then there's the other case of scenario. So this is equivalent to the graphs I just showed you from the Caldera lab. So here's the loss of all of the blue from our business as usual scenario. So this is where the CO2 reaches 950. And then if you apply it for 5 kilograms, if you repeat the calculation with 5 kilograms per meter squared of basalt, then you start to recover the aragonite saturation state of the oceans. So the simulations suggest that if it's done at scale and it's done often enough, then it would have an effect on CO2, ocean chemistry, and ocean pH. But of course, that's just a thought experiment, right? Nobody in their right mind would want to sprinkle basalt over the tropical rainforest, not only for the practical difficulties, but also because of the effects on biodiversity. But what about thinking about how this might operate with global croplands? And it turns out there's a number of, not only is the area of global croplands sufficiently large that it potentially has an impact on CO2, but there are also a number of ancillary benefits to crops that will potentially make it a good idea and worth investigating. So let's just unpack some of those. So human societies have known that volcanic soils are very productive all the way back to Pliny the Elder in 79 AD. And the reason that the volcanic soils are fertile is twofold. First of all, they're very rich in plant nutrients, and they also weather rapidly. And so here's a little pie chart of basalt, and you can see that it has trace amounts of phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, iron, and silica, which is often released in a form that's taken up by the plants. And then on the top here, this is rates of weathering by plants after a few months, different plant species. So there's banana, rape, lupin, and maize. And the first bar is control, and then each of these panels represents a different element. So you can see that there's increased weathering of magnesium, of calcium, sodium, silica, and iron. So first take-home message, if we did it with crops, potentially it would fertilize them. Why manage crops? Well, the first thing is that we know, as I said earlier, we're already applying crushed rock fragments to the fields. So we already have the infrastructure and the machinery in place to deploy this at scale relatively quickly. The second point is that almost 11% of the Earth's surface is under active management for cropland production, so this gives us a large area, so we can deploy at scale. And deploying at scale is important because we want to start capturing carbon and storing it as soon as possible, for those reasons that I showed you earlier with the closing door of climate targets. But beyond fertilizing crops, we also need to think about this from an economic perspective for the farmers. What's in it for them? What are the benefits for them that might lower the barriers to take up or incentivize rollout? And so I just want to go through a few of these, and then I'll take you through some case studies that provide some of the underpinning science to support these ideas. So we've already seen the idea that you might fertilize crops by providing them with nutrients. But there's fairly good evidence that it would also stimulate the mycorrhizal fungal symbionts, and this could further enhance pea uptake. You could also gain increased crop protection from pests and diseases by taking up silica. Not only does silica toughen cells, but it also primes the plant immune system. Soil acidification is a major problem in most of the croplands of the world, and as basalt weathers, it releases alkalinity, as I said earlier, so it can help ameliorate soil acidification, and acidified soils lower the yield and growth of plants by affecting nutrient uptake. It also, so if you reduce acidification, you lower uptake of heavy metals, and that increases yields. And another problem with soils that have been farmed intensively for many decades is they get depleted in micronutrients, particularly things like iron and zinc. And if you dress the soils with a silicate rock, then you also restore those microelements, and that improves the nutrition of your crops. And there's also emerging evidence that if you shift the soils away from acid pH, then you can reduce emissions of CO2 and N2O. So all of these effects, if you could improve the nutritional quality of your crop, you could improve yields, and you could make them, you could increase their protection against pests and diseases, then the bottom line would be that it would decrease usage of pesticides and fertilizers, and also reduce the costs associated with those applications. So I'm just going to take you through then a few examples, case studies that support some of these points. So sugarcane is a major crop, bioenergy crop, and particularly in Brazil, where it's grown on heavily weathered, nutrient-poor, acidic soils. And this requires a large amount of lime to correct the soil acidity. And there's been some studies done in Mauritius in the 60s where they looked at the effect of basalt application in combination with fertilizers to see how it affects the yields of sugarcane. And this is a fully kind of randomized design. And this is the increase in yield relative to sugarcane plots that had only fertilizer. And you can see that when they start adding basalt, then they get a significant increase in yields. And I think they were so stunned by this that they then repeated it a few years later with more basalt applications, and again got the same result. So this is increases in yields over control plots that had fertilizer. And in the 60s, they didn't really have a clear idea why they were getting this yield increases, but they speculated, and I think some of these speculations were along the lines that I've just been talking about. So you have improved silica nutrition, so you get silica uptake from the basalt as it weathers, and the maize plants need it to build phytoliths. If you enhance your mycorrhizal activity, not only do you increase pea uptake, but you could also enhance your trace element uptake, and it probably reduced soil acidity. So thinking about how this might affect soil chemistry, let's have a look at the next example. So this is cocoa grown in Malaysia on highly weathered soils. This is basalt application rate. Okay, this is silica concentration in the plant. So the silica goes up in the plants. Aluminium toxicity decreases. manganese toxicity decreases, and then they also got a reduction in soil pH, so the acidity of the soil was ameliorated by the treatment, in line with geochemical theory. So these are effects of basalt that we'd kind of predict a priori on soil properties, and which they're seeing in these experiments. And this translated into increased growth. So this is the growth of the cocoa plants in terms of height, 12 months after, up to 24 months after application. So the dotted line is the control, and then these solid lines are various applications of basalt. So you get a 60% increase in the height, and similarly with the plant diameter. So the plants grew better. What about crop protection? So soybean is a major crop in the US and elsewhere in the world. And there have been trials where they've looked at young soybean plants that have been dosed either with limestone, which is the kind of usual practice for addressing soil acidification. And then they've also dosed it with silicate. This is the leaf silica. So obviously the plants that are getting calcium silicates take up silica, and the plants that get limestone don't take it up. And then they subjected these young plants to downy mildew, and they were able to show that if you are exposed to an increasing dose of a calcium silicate, then the incidence of downy mildew dropped, but you don't see that with limestone. And so another commercially important fungus that attacks these young soybean plants is frog's eye spot, and there saw a similar thing here. So here's the dose of the treatment. Limestone, no major effect on the incidence of infection, whereas if you dose them with calcium silicate, then you get a reduction in the infection. And it's a similar story with sugarcane. So we've just seen sugarcane yields increase. This is some work that's been done looking at stem borers, stalk borers on sugarcane. So this is the number of borers per stalk. This is what happens if you add, these two are lime treatments and these two are silicate rock treatments. You get a reduction in the number of borers per stalk. And this one on the right-hand side shows you about the percentage of stalk that's bored, which also decreases as you provide a silicate rock. So conceivably for sugarcane then, you're not only increasing the yield, but you're also protecting it from one of the major pests. And it's a similar story with palm oil. So oil palm is a major crop in tropical regions. And one of the key fungal disease that it suffers from is basal stem rot disease, which is caused by a fungus called Ganoderma. And this is a healthy palm, and this is the sort of pathology trajectory of what happens when this thing dies of stem rot. And so they've done trials showing that if you apply a calcium silicate, then the disease severity of this economically important disease declines quite dramatically, from nearly 100% for the control down to about 50% for the higher rate. So there are a number of reasons then why we might expect application of these silicate rocks to the land surface to be important, but if we're going to roll it out at a global scale, or near global scale, what sort of rock amounts are we talking about? Well, if you were optimizing it, you'd be looking at somewhere between, depending on the application rate, somewhere between 9 and 45 petagrams of rock per year. So that's a significant amount of rock. But on the other hand, we're through a whole range of different processes, making cement, making basic iron or steel slag, and burning coal in coal-fired power stations. Through all of these processes, we're producing nearly 20 petagrams of silicate waste, which we could recycle. And if we began thinking about how to recycle our silicate waste in this way, you'd get 10 tons per hectare free, and you'd get a dosage of, you'd get sort of 40 to 50% of this would be free as well. So it's a question about thinking about recycling our silicate waste to think about how this might be deployed. So I'm just going to show you one example. So I have a grad student who's working on enhanced basalt weathering with sorghum, so Mike Kelland. And Mike's devised a system where he's been thinking about what happens if you grow sorghum in a natural agricultural soil with and without basalt. How does it affect weathering rates, and how does it affect soil acidification, how does it affect yield and nutrient content, and how does it affect heavy metal accumulation in the seed heads. So Mike's designed these, what we call these weathering reactor columns, and so the sorghum is grown in natural soil, and in the first 25 centimetres the soil is mixed with basalt, and then the lower 25 centimetres it isn't. And then he has either applies 10 kilograms or he has control plants. And then he has a particle size distribution of his basalt. If you can see, so this is a log scale for particle size. This is the basalt that went into the soil. And then the red trace shows you a frequency histogram of that. And you can see that it's basically peaking out of particles that are fine sand, around 100 micrometers. Now, we're still working with chemists in Southampton to develop strontium isotope budgets of weathering. But as a first look-see, we did ICP-MS analysis on the leachate draining from the pot using rubidium as a tracer, because the rubidium in the basalt, it turns out to be much higher than the background in the soil. And you can see that when you have a plant plus basalt plus soil, then you have quite a high spike in rubidium compared to when you just have soil or soil plus basalt. So there's a doubling, at least, of weathering rate going on in those columns. And this is important because there's a recent paper published in Nature Climate Change where they tried to estimate the cost of carbon capture of different CO2 negative emissions approaches. So there was crops with BECCS and forest with BECCS and CDR, and here's enhanced weathering. And this huge variation in cost is driven solely by the assumptions of particle size. So if you need to get your particle sizes down to 10 micrometers in diameter, then you have a very high cost because of the energy expenditure on grinding. But what Mike has shown is if you go for sand-sized particles, when you've got biology involved, then you can reduce the cost because it'll weather just as quickly. Now, Mike grew these plants through to maturity, and he showed there was no, interestingly, there's no effect of the basalt addition on shoot biomass, but he got a 25% increase in seed production, in yield. He also digested his seed heads to look for heavy metal concentrations. And so the blue is no amendment, and the orange is with basalt. And you can see there's no enrichment in any of these heavy metals as a result of growing in the basalt. You did see a 25% increase in silica concentration. And we have another PhD, myself and Jurian Tun and Judy Scholes, looking at the role of silica uptake in priming the plant immune system. So that's work that's ongoing. So we're still in the process of analysing this data. We haven't calculated carbon capture, and we haven't figured out immunity to pests and diseases, but it's a first step. So I just want to finish by flagging some other work that the centre's doing. So we have 3 catchment scale sites in different parts of the world. In the US, we're working on agro-corn systems to look at how they might capture carbon. We're also working with Wilmar and the Southeast Asian Rainforest Project to investigate carbon capture with instrumented oil palm catchments. And then we're also working with Michael Bird and Paul Nelson in Australia to look at carbon capture by sugarcane. I just want to show you a couple of really neat things about the energy farm. So out in the US, we're working with Steve Long and Evan DeLucia, and they run this energy farm facility, which has, one of the key features of it is it has these 4 3.8 hectare blocks, and each of the blocks is monitored by eddy covariance with Carbonaki. And then beneath it, it has a tile drain system so you can collect the leachate and analyze the chemistry. And just to show you the arrangement, so this year we're dosing with basalt for the first time. And so these are the tile drains. So we have switchgrass, which is a bioenergy crop with basalt, switchgrass without basalt. And then this year it's corn with basalt and corn without basalt. And then the tile drains that run beneath these all collect to separate automatic collection points, so we can actually work through the year and collect samples of soil water for chemical analysis. And so we can use this information then on soil solution chemistry and the above ground fluxes with eddy covariance and soil responsometers to draw up a carbon budget and figure out how much those systems are capturing carbon in response to the basalt treatments. Now, I mentioned earlier about the need to incentivize the approach, assuming that it would work. And a key area of this work is with sugarcane as a bioenergy crop in Australia. And there's a number of reasons to expect that it improve soil water quality and reduce greenhouse gas emissions alongside carbon sequestration benefits. But it also have an enormous effect on the financial cost of this system. So if we got just a 10% increase in yield on around 10% of the industry, because most of the sugarcane in Australia is grown on highly weathered, nutrient-poor, acidic soils, then it would translate into something like a 20 million a year increase in profits for the farmers. Now, one of the curious things about bioenergy in Australia is it's all going on in Queensland, which is right off the coast of the Great Barrier Reef. Now, the Australian government annually spends about $8 million a year in an effort to try and combat poor water quality for the water that's draining over the reef. And one of the main problems is nitrogen and phosphorus, which flows into the system and causes eutrophication. But as Michael Bird and Paul Nelson have both pointed out to me, if you could increase the silica to phosphorus or the silica to nitrogen ratio of the system, then you actually shift the system away from an algae-dominated system more to a non-siliceous algae-dominated system. So you basically support more diatoms. And if you have more diatoms, you have a richer, more productive ecosystem, and of course you capture more carbon. Okay, so I just want to finish then by returning back to where we started. So the Paris Agreement then, the ambition was to try and keep global warming to 2 degrees or less. And as I've tried to explain, this will require negative emissions alongside phase down in our emissions. And the problem with this is there's no technologies ready to roll out on an industrial scale that could do this. And so this really highlights the need for more research into these areas. Well, one of the favoured approaches is called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And so the idea here is that you grow your plants, and then you harvest the plants, and you burn them for energy, and you capture the CO2, you pressurise it, liquefy it, and inject it into a geological aquifer. But, one of the problems with this then is that you're going to need a huge land area to grow your bioenergy crops, and that takes it out of production for food. And so some estimates suggest that the land area may be 3 times the size of India by the end of the 21st century, when we're trying to feed a population of maybe 11 billion. So another approach then is direct air capture. And again, we don't have the technology, and we aren't in a position to even think about deploying this at scale. So it seems to us a complementary approach is to think about enhanced weathering, and this not only has the benefits of capturing carbon, slowing acidification and improving fisheries, but also has these ancillary benefits for improving crop production in terms of restoring soils, improving fertilizer usage because we don't have to use so many, and increasing food production and protection. So I'm just going to finish by showing that actually it's also done right. This could address a number of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, because we're contributing to food security, so it would be improving zero hunger. But also be thinking about more responsible management of soils. So not only would you be reducing fertilizer usage, but one of the long-term effects of adding silicate rocks to soils is that they get converted into clays, and clays are superb for improving the nutrient holding capacity of soils. And you'd also increase the nutritional value of crops by adding those micronutrients back in. It's clearly an action on climate change. It'd help protect fisheries, both directly by taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, but potentially by changing the water quality. And you'd also be protecting life on land. If you could grow more crops for a given land area, then reduces the pressure on deforestation. So I think with that, I'm going to stop there, and I'll just acknowledge we've got a wonderful core team that are behind the centre, and all of them have contributed to the ideas that I've talked about today. So very happy to take questions.